From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, book lovers. Everyone at the Post is very, very proud and happy that we're sponsoring this wonderful event, and we're very grateful to people like you, book lovers like you, who come out and have made it such an incredible success. Our next speaker, Gregory Maguire, is a man blessed with a love of children, a love of writing, and a remarkably creative imagination. All these qualities have helped make him a prolific and tremendously successful author of both adult and children's books. Gregory received his PhD in literature from Tufts University, and by the age of 24, had published his first book for children, the first of more than 20. About 20 years ago, he was in London when the outbreak of war caused a certain national leader to be proclaimed the new Hitler. He thought about this, and it led him to consider writing a novel about Hitler. Instead, happily, he focused on a somewhat less horrendous figure and wrote a novel about the Wicked Witch of the West. As you know, it was a bestseller, it inspired a great Broadway musical, and it certainly changed forever the way we look at Oz. It's a great pleasure to introduce Gregory Maguire.
Thank you. Since we started that way, I will say how interested I was when I made the transition from the notion of writing about Hitler as an example of evil that we could all understand to writing about the Wicked Witch of the West as an example of evil that we could all understand, and then to realize that the word Hitler and the word wicked are very similar in that there's both 6 letters, they're 2 syllables, and they have 2 short vowels in them, an I and an E, in the same order. I'm not mathematical at all, but I thought I would tell you that. I don't know, this crowd doesn't look too formal. May I take off my jacket? Oh, thank you. If you had a jacket, you would have to take yours off too now. How about the tie? I thought, although there's not, we're requested not to do too much reading, I thought I would start by reading about 3 or 3.5 pages of Out of Oz. It is coming out on November 1st. It is the 4th and final book in the Wicked series called The Wicked Years. This is a prologue. It would take Dorothy Gale and her relatives 3 days to reach the mountains by train from Kansas, the conductor told them. No matter what the school teacher had said about Galileo, Copernicus, and those other spoil sports, any cockamamie theory that the world was round remained refuted by the geometrical instrument of a rattling train applied to the spare facts of a prairie. Dorothy watched eagles and hawks careering too high to cast shadows. She watched the returning larks and bluebirds, and she wondered what they knew about the shape of the world and if they would ever tell her. Then the Rockies began to ice up along the spring horizon beyond the shoot-'em-up town of Denver. Uncle Henry had never seen such a sight. He declared himself bewildered at their height. They surely do remind me of the great Kells of Oz, agreed Dorothy, though the Kells looked less bossy somehow. She tried to ignore the glance Uncle Henry shared with Aunt Em. Some of the passes being snowed over, even in early April, the train made slower progress than the timetable had promised. Aunt Em fretted that their hotel room would be given away. Uncle Henry replied with an attempt at savoir-faire. I'll wire ahead at the next opportunity, Em. Hush yourself and enjoy the nation. What a charade that they were accustomed to taking fancified holidays. They had little extra money for emergencies, Dorothy knew. They were spending their savings. The train chuffed along valleys, noisy with rushing waters, inched along trestles as if testing them for purchase. It lollygagged up slopes. One cloudy afternoon, it maneuvered through so many switchbacks that the travelers lost all notion of east and west. In her seat, Dorothy hummed a little. Once she thought she saw a castle on a bridge, but it was only a tricky rock formation. But I never before saw a rock that looked like a castle, said Aunt Em brightly. You never saw a castle, thought Dorothy, and tried not to be disappointed. They worried their way through Nevada and its brownish springtime, and at last came down into California through a napland of orchards and vineyards. When the train paused outside Sacramento to take on tinder, Dorothy saw a white peacock strutting along next to the tracks like a general surveying his troops. It paused at her window and fanned out its impossible stitchery. She could have sworn it was a white peacock and that it would speak. But Toto began to yap out the open window, and the bird kept its own counsel. Finally, the train shrugged and chuffed into San Francisco, a city so big and filthy and confounding that Uncle Henry dared to murmur, "This beats your old Emerald City, I'll warrant." "Henry," said his wife, "pursed lips are kind lips." They found their hotel. The clerk was nice enough, a clean young man whose lips weren't so much pursed as rubied. He forgave their delay, but could no longer supply them with a room only one flight up, as they'd been promised. Aunt Em refused to try Mr. Otis's hydraulic elevator, so they had to climb 5 flights. They carried their own bags to avoid having to tip. There's about 5 more pages in which the reader comes to understand that the main reason for this trip is to try to jog the memory, the obsession of Oz out of Dorothy and make her suitable for marriage to a Kansas farmer. Aunt Em takes to her bed and doesn't get up for a few days. And Dorothy and Uncle Henry examine a few places like Chinatown, and they try to find, they try to get to the sea so Dorothy can see the ocean. But when they get there, it's covered with fog, and they can't make out a thing. She doesn't really believe it exists. Finally, they go out one night for dinner, and she promises Uncle Henry she will retire her notions of Oz and come to her senses and live with her beliefs, but privately for the rest of her life, so as not to ruin her life and theirs. And then, when they get back to the hotel, they try to go up to the elevator to the 9th floor to see if they can see the ocean from there, but they can't because it's dark. What they see, however, is a space of black without any lights. "That's it," says Uncle Henry. "It's there, but you can't see it." Like Oz, thinks Dorothy. Beyond the ocean, what's there? The land of the Japanese and the Chinese, a whole society of them, all talking in that singy-song way they got. And the ocean, she could hardly bear it. "What's it like?" "I ain't never seen it yet, but tomorrow we can come back here." She was lost that night when she finally managed to sleep in the raspy claw of dreams that would not declare themselves fully. As the first light weakened the blackness of sky, but long before dawn, Toto began to whine. "Hush! Auntie Em is feeling poorly after our long trip," whispered Dorothy, but Toto needed to go outside. Dorothy hunched herself into her clothes and let herself out of the room, leaving the door open a crack so she could return without disturbing her worthy relatives. It didn't take long to find Toto a scrap of junk ground in which to do his business. Dorothy turned her head. Many of the lights were lowered now, but there was a strange apprehensiveness to the street, like the setting of a stage in which a play was about to begin. The charcoal of the night decayed into a smokier shade. "Come on," We'll be in all manner of trouble if they find us out on the street alone, said Dorothy. Let's go up. In the lobby, she saw the elevator man asleep in a lounge chair, his hair to one side and his little cap askew. In that funny high-waisted jacket, he looked like a flying monkey she'd once known. How were they ever affording this? Poor dear Henry and poor Em, late of the Kansas prairie. So frightened of her, so eager for an acceptable future. She would make it worth their while. She stepped into the cage and pulled the door shut. The door was fretted, like sets of linked scissors, like the threads of an old apron if you scrub it too hard with lye. Connected to itself, but airy. There was a single control as far as she could see. She gripped the brass handle and revolved it a full half-turn, and the floor began to lift, with Dorothy and Toto inside. She almost squealed, but she knew the merest sound might wake the elevator attendant, and she risked being put in jail for ambushing a lift and taking it on a joyride. The perforated room sailed up past the 5th floor all the way to the 9th, which led to the roof. She remembered. She tiptoed from the elevator cabin and shouldered her way through the door into the chill of dawn above the ocean. In the few moments she'd been rising in the lift, the sky had lightened that much more. The effect was not so smoky, more pearlescent. The buildings at this hour seemed less defined by light. They looked like stone formations left behind after some unimaginable geologic event. She could make out a tongue of sea beyond the building to the west, but no sound from this far away, no apparent motion, only a lapidary expanse dimming and shading into the sky. No horizon line, just endlessness, sea and sky inseparable. Toto began to whimper and jump around as if he wanted to leap from the 9th floor. It's not frightening. It isn't, she said. It's just the ocean and another world on the other side. You know about all that. You're the best traveled mutt in history. Toto, stop your fussing. What are you fussing about? The dog appeared to be going mad, running in circles around her and yipping in distress. Oh, Toto, stop that infernal fussing. The wind isn't going to take you. Once in your life was enough. She picked up the dog and went back into the building. The elevator was where she had left it, quivering at this height. She would ride it down to the 5th floor and go in and rest next to her uncle and aunt. She had spied something of the ocean, some little hem of it. The globe was round. She could see there was another world beyond this one. That would have to do. Some corn-blind farmer, walled on 4 sides of his life by superior alfalfa, was waiting for her. She began her descent. She passed the 8th floor and the 7th. At 5:15 on the morning of April 18th, 1906, the buildings of San Francisco started to shake. Now, so the truth is, Dorothy makes a little bit more than a cameo appearance in Out of Oz. I thought what I would do is tell a little bit about how Wicked came to be, but furthermore, how it came to be extended into 4 novels. You heard about my experience living in London at the beginning of the First Gulf War and reading in the Times Saddam Hussein, the next Hitler, and realizing in myself that my pulse quickened with anxiety at the application of that single word, Hitler. I, who am largely a pacifist, found myself compelled toward that terrible argument, when is war justified? What is the moral justification for war? And the use of the word Hitler arose in me a kind of fear, behind which arose in me a kind of grittiness and sense that if war was necessary, would I have the courage to allow myself to think so? I came to other conclusions about that war in time, not too many others, but the main thing I realized was the change in my body temperature on the application of the word Hitler. I realized that Hitler must be one of the strongest words in the English language. I don't know for how long that will be true, but I think it's still true. And then I began to be interested in the question of evil and where it arises and how we can identify it, when at about the same time there was the horrible story, most people here are old enough to remember it, I think, of the 2-year-old boy in Liverpool or Birmingham or Manchester in England who wandered away from his mother's apron strings in a butcher shop in a mall to be found, as was later discovered, by a couple of boys playing hooky who took him by 2 hands as if he was their baby brother, walked him around the town while his mother was desperate looking for him, bought him ice cream, and eventually murdered him with bricks and left his body on railroad tracks so that it would look as if he'd gotten run over by accident. The question in one's mind about an 11-year-old boy, how could an 11-year-old boy wake up in the morning, have his Weetabix, and be a murderer by the time he went to bed? What does that say about our species? And what does it say about our capacity? And how do we govern it? That question, an intimate question, a family question, governed with the question of the comedy of nations and how we decide as nations to deal with conflict and to deal with differences of opinion, began to burn in my head like a very bad and permanent virus. And I knew if I did not write about evil at some point, I would never come to any conclusions. So yes, I jumped over the question of Hitler because I didn't speak German and I didn't think I had the nous, as it were, to do all the research. And I settled on the Wicked Witch of the West because in my mental Rolodex of villains, she clearly is the second most scary creature in my mental Rolodex. You know, I mean, I'll get you and your little dog. Tata, or Titi, or Tata, whatever the hell it is. She just terrified me as a child. My parents were very strict. I grew up in upstate New York. They did not believe in the cultural blandishments of television. They believed in the written word. They were both writers. And we were allowed a very meager diet of television. But once a year, because there was not yet a video mesmerama where there was 24/7 for every, crime and insult you can need, once a year, appearing annually on the same kind of church calendar as Christmas and Easter, there was our national holiday of terror, the airing of The Wizard of Oz on CBS. And once a year, we were allowed a special dispensation from my parental units to watch a 90-minute film on TV that with commercials lasted 2 hours. And because of the spare diet of images of which I was raised, although I was raised with lots of children's books, that story got into me, as I think it got into many of my generation, in a very particular way. It really does seem like a basic foundational text of the 20th century and its concept of children, and it's a transitional text, I think, from the 18th century Age of Enlightenment and the 19th century goals of Emerson and Thoreau into the 20th century when America became a world power. I do believe it's one of the great transitional texts and foundational texts of our nation at this point. So there it is, my memory of the story, my memory of the witch, and my need to write about evil. And suddenly, I had that experience, which you could consider the visit of a muse or maybe, divine blessing. I thought, the Wicked Witch of the West, nobody knows anything about her. L. Frank Baum says nothing about her. On the movie, she's only on screen for 12 and a half minutes. Her background is completely open. Nobody can criticize me and say, I got Hitler's youth wrong. It's open. Nobody knows about it. Nobody can say I did the research wrong. And I thought, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I've just had a vision. And it's Margaret Hamilton. And she's come down out of the sky to say, you have blessings, my child. Tell my story, or I'll get you, you little dog! So I decided I would tell her story, and I wrote Wicked in 5 months. I didn't write it in 5 months contiguously. I wrote 2 months, then took 2 months off. I had to earn a living after all. I wrote a month, took a month off, and then I finished it in the last 2 months. And it was published to pretty good reviews, pretty good to very good reviews, with one notable exception that I never mention. The New York Times, but that's all right. And it did not get on the bestseller list the season it was published, but the year after it was published, it sold more books than the year before. And the year after that, it sold more books. And for the first 9 years of its publication, every 6 months, my royalty rate went up by word of mouth. You know, I didn't get picked by Oprah, and I didn't get the blessing of the New York Times bestseller list. But readers read the book and said, you might like this, you might like it, you might like it. You wouldn't, stay away. It's not a book for everybody, clearly. It's a big, fat, thick, intentionally turgid 19th century novel. In 2004, the play Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, opened. At that point, the book had sold about 750,000 copies in 8 years. And in the years since the play, it's sold about 6 million copies, I think. So I was very happy for the play. People wonder, you know, what does the play do to you? And I say, well, it gives you a $22 million advertising budget that goes on year after year after year all over the United States. I mean, you know, that's fine. Thank you very much. When the idea of the play came up, first the book had been optioned by Hollywood, by Demi Moore. And I was really excited at first. Demi Moore, I thought, Demi Moore naked and green on the cover of Vanity Fair. Wow. Yeah, I could go for that. But Demi Moore and Bruce Willis, her then husband, were having, you know, difficulties. And, you know, he called her a witch or something, and she'd lost interest in the project. Meanwhile, Stephen Schwartz, the composer of Godspell and Pippin, both pieces I knew very well, had read the book and knew it was his comeback to Broadway. But Universal Studios already had it optioned for a film that was going nowhere, mind you, because in 1997 up to 2004, it still was true, and I think it remains true, that no matter how good an actress you have, actresses don't command films that have budgets of $100 million. And this is basically a story about women, mostly. You know, there was no role for Brad Pitt as the Wicked Witch of the West, so they could not sanction a $100 million budget to make the film. So it was kind of languishing, and I was happy because I was, you know, doing okay. Then Stephen Schwartz went to Hollywood, closed the door, and he said to Mark Platt, the producer eventually of the play, I know why you're not getting a decent script in this. He said, why? And Stephen Schwartz said, because Americans know that everybody in Oz sings, and you need to have singing. And Mark Platt, who had been watching how much money Disney had been making on Broadway with their productions of The Little Mermaid and The Lion King, etc., said, that makes perfect sense to me, but you're going to have to convince Gregory because he has the rights. So Stephen Schwartz and I talked through our lawyers, and about a year later, we went through a walk in the Connecticut woods. It was an undisclosed location that I can't identify to you. And we were dressed in trench coats and snap-brimmed hats, and it was like Cold War, you know, Kirka 2002. There was a mist in the trees, and I'm sure there were werewolves somewhere around, but his job was to convince me that this would make a good play. And I, you know, having a Scottish Presbyterian background in my father's line, I have the capacity to look extremely disapproving even when I'm quite happy and jolly and even goofy. So I walked along like an academic who hadn't gotten tenure, and Stephen Schwartz got more and more nervous. Beads of sweat started rolling down his eyes, and he said, the thing about movies, he said, is despite everything that cinematographics can do now, nonetheless, most of a movie, 90% of a movie is a close-up, and all that green, you know, on the giant screen is going to give people a headache. Besides, the art of acting since the 1950s has largely been the art of discretion and of just implying your moods. But he said Elphaba has big moods, and it's a 19th century novel, and if you put her on the play, if you put her on the stage, at some point she can give those big moods out. She will be able to walk to the edge of the stage, and it will be as if she's alone. She'll be able to give a soliloquy in music, and she will draw people to her, and she will catch people, sort of like So, you get the picture. He made his point. How did you do on that, by the way? It exhausted you, didn't it? I was deeply persuaded, and then he said, but I still had my expression of, and he said, getting nervouser, he said, I'm so convinced you're going to see the rightness of my argument that I will tell you I've already written the first song. I said, yes, and he said, it's going to be called No One Mourns the Wizard. And he described how it was going to start the play, and it was pretty much the way it is now. And with those 5 words, he had it. He had the project in the bag. No one mourns the wizard. With those 5 words, he convinced me that he knew what my book was about. It wasn't about a plot. It wasn't really even about a character. It just appeared to be about a character. It was about an idea. It was about a moral need to take our time before we decide who's good and who's bad. That was why I wrote the book, and he proved me he understood it with those 5 words. So I still, didn't say yes, but not right away. I let him swing a little bit in the breeze. But eventually I said yes. The play opened, and imagine my surprise on the opening night in San Francisco when the stage doors opened and Idina Menzel rushed out on the screen, onto the stage, and 1,700 people all chapped and cleared for her arrival. It was like having a really serious drug flashback, And I'm a Catholic. I didn't do that kind of drugs. The notion of 1,700 real live people in the same room as you, having the same vision, thinking the same things that you had thought once, and you were the only one in the world ever to think them, was really amazing, transformative experience. So that was how Wicked came to be and how it came to be on the stage. And although, yes, the plot is different in the play, and there are a few tiny little changes at the end, yes, I do love the play. I love it seriously. I don't have to lie about it. I adore it. But I also adore my original vision. And so when the photos of Abu Ghraib were first coming out on the cover of the Washington Post and the Boston Globe and the New York Times, my sense of distress about what was happening there was serious enough that I thought, again, if I don't do something about this, my head is going to explode, and I'm going to die, and I won't be able to take care of my children. So I thought, I need to go back into a world in which I can control a little bit of both the corruption and the moral bravery. So I need to go back to Oz. It wasn't because I needed to make any more money, which was a nice thing to say, something that writers don't expect ever to say in their lives. It was because I needed to consider a new question. There is Elphaba, who is a one-off. They broke the mold when they made her, but she's gone. So what do we do without our obvious heroes? What do we do when we don't have a moral leader to tell us how to think? That's the place that all of us are in as citizens, and we still have to act. Son of a Witch is about Elphaba's son, Lear, who is 14 when his mother disappears, and he has to live life anyway without her magic powers. What does he do? How does he get on? That was the story, Son of a Witch. A Lion Among Men followed a couple years later about the Cowardly Lion, and every time I tell a little bit more of the story, you get another person's point of view, which is part of my whole method anyway, to say no one of us has the whole picture. We need to talk to one another so that we can get a larger point of view. We can only ever have binocularity unless we stand together and tell each other what we see. And then we have multiple ocularity. Every pair of eyes in this room, in this tent, shares in that obligation, and every voice shares. So here we come to Out of Oz, and this is about the end of what I'm going to say, having read you a little bit. In the end, and this is, I think, the end, I decided if I did not pull the emergency cord on the train, I was going to be driving to Oz for the rest of my life. And I'm only 57. I like to think I have a long creative life ahead of me, so I thought I will signal to myself that I'm done. I have answered lots of questions in this book that I purposely left open in the first 3 books, but I've also tried to give it a sense of cheery and slightly sad finality. And I won't tell you any more about the plot, except that Glinda is under house arrest, and the Cowardly Lion's on the run from the law. And as you know, somebody put out the welcome mat because Dorothy's coming back. So that's where I'll stop, I think. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer some questions. Please.
This sounds so small, given your...
No, go ahead.
In Wicked, Elphaba is sealed in at the end, and the legendary woman is also sealed in a cave. And I wondered if there was an intended parallel in that, and if so, what it was.
The question is, I think you could probably all hear it, but at the end of Wicked, Elphaba is sealed in, and there's a story that's implied being told throughout Wicked of a kind of a fairy tale that ends with the evil character being walled in a cave with rocks. And is there an intended parallel, and what is it? Yes, there is an intended parallel. What it is depends on you. I put a lot of material in there, and I put a lot of questions, and I answer them very seldom. Sometimes I know what the answers are myself, but I think the best way of engaging a reader is not by being a third-grade teacher saying, "This is it, honey, you better get it or you're going to fail this test." No, you pass the test by deciding for yourself what is the connection between those two stories. Okay? Yes, please.
I just want to say, first of all, I love the way you twist fairy tales and reinvent them in all your books and recreate this world that we grew up thinking there's got to be more to this, and then there is. And all of your books, you have very strong women. You have a very feminist angle on your writing. From Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister and Mirror, Mirror, to the Wicked books. And I guess I kind of wanted to ask you about that. It's unusual for a male author to have such strong women as their characters, and I kind of wanted you to elaborate a little bit on that for me, please.
Well, I used to say to that question about why do I write about women as often or more than writing about men, is that, we all know women are more interesting. Hello, I mean, I'm like any other person at a professional career. I take the path of least resistance. I mean, I don't understand men myself. I mean, I often don't. I used to say that as a joke, but of course, as most jokes go, there is a certain amount of truth to it. I think largely, and this is a horrible generalization, of course, but I think women are able to think in contingencies, like if this, then that, if this, then that, and are able to hold ambiguities in their minds more easily than men. I think men like it to be an on-off switch. You're either right or you're wrong. It's either my way or the highway, as somebody said recently. And I think success in life and curiosity and interest in life comes from ambivalence and curiosity, and being forced by ambivalence and curiosity to keep turning over a question. So women just naturally make better characters for that, for me, or at least my mind is the way. John Updike didn't think so, but I do. And interestingly, I just heard Terry Gross's interview of Maurice Sendak, who's both a friend and a great inspiration to me, and he said virtually the same thing about women on Terry Gross this week. So I thought, well, if he can say it publicly, I can say it too. Yes, please. Thank you.
This also has to do with, it doesn't actually have to do with Wicked, but your other twisted fairy tales, I love them all. They're fantastic. And I was just wondering where you get your inspiration to twist different fairy tales and if there's more coming.
The question about inspiration has to do with what is it in fairy tales, I think, that inspires you to use them, and how do you get the inspiration? The thing about fairy tales, and to some extent even about The Wizard of Oz, too, is that if a story is at one and the same time both familiar, wildly familiar, and also open or porous for different reasons. Sometimes a story is open or porous because the author hasn't really done a good job or hasn't thought it important to fill in the background. That was the case with The Wizard of Oz. in terms of the witch. Even the original novel, it still makes my blood run cold to see the argument that the wizard gives on the page to Dorothy about killing the witch. I will help you get back to Kansas, but you must do one thing for me first. In Oz, nobody gets anything without paying for it. Oh, but what must I do? You must kill the wicked witch of the West. Oh, but I never killed anybody. That is not my concern. She is wicked and deserves to die. Oh, okay then. And that's all the argument given to Dorothy, that she has to become a murderer, an assassin. Just that somebody called her wicked. That was it. He didn't give one instance. There was no proof. It was just the word. So that, to me, that's an opening. Without the proof, if he hasn't supplied the proof, then it's legitimate for me to think, where was the proof? What was it? That's what I mean by porous and having handholds. In the case of the fairy tales are so old that lots of times things that might have made sense 500 years ago are now just images, and they've kind of gotten broken away. Like, why are Cinderella's glass slippers glass? I mean, nobody knows that. They don't have to be glass for everything else to happen it's not as if an important plot point is that, she steps on them and gets a glass sliver in her toe and, severs her nerve and she can't make it back to the carriage in time. I mean, there's no reason for those slippers to be glass. They're just imagistic. They might have had a reason once. Incidentally, there's one school of thought that says the reason Cinderella's glass slippers are glass is that it's a mistranslation from the French for verre, meaning fur, V-E-R-R-E, I think, rather than the other verre, which means glass. That maybe they're originally fur slippers. They're like something you get from L.L. Bean, She wanted to be comfy dancing. I mean, she was a good dancer, So that, too, that's what I mean by something being old and porous. These old tales that we all share, including the mysteries in them, are open to all of us to reconsider. And no matter what I ever do to a story, it never besmirches the original. The original lives in our minds, and it belongs to all of us. And I can't ruin it. I can only play with it. And you can play with it, too. You should try. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to thank you so much for saying yes to do the Broadway musical. I love the book Wicked, love it, and I love the musical, and I have seen it several times, and it never fails to empower me. And that, that character of Elphaba is just amazing with the defying gravity, and that all that strength is in every single one of us if we just choose to be able to know that we can change and we can rise and we can change for good.
But thank you so much, and I have to admit, I'm sort of interrupting your question, but I have to admit, sometimes when I'm sort of down-spirited, I sing Defying Gravity in the shower, and I'm kind of getting inspiration from my own character, and there's something a little onanistic about that, But nonetheless, I appreciate what you mean. When the cast album first came out, I was in New York City signing it with the rest of the cast. And Idina Menzel was sitting at the table a couple of seats down from me. And the play had only been opened about 6 weeks or 8 weeks at that point. But about every seventh person getting this album signed leaned over and had to hug Idina Menzel. And I was close enough to be able to hear what the women were saying. It was almost always women. And I remember one woman was a Palestinian with the traditional headscarf. And I heard her clutch Idina's shoulders. I saw her clutch Idina's shoulders and say, I have lived in this country for 7 years, and I've never seen myself portrayed anywhere. And I was crying, I'm still crying. It's okay. It just looks like sweat. It's okay. So on to your question.
No, I really didn't have a question.
Oh, okay.
That really is
Okay.
what I just wanted to tell
thank you.
is that, I listened to that CD, Defying Gravity, on the way to work.
Oh.
And believe me, by the time I get there, I'm ready for it.
Right.
So,
It's
thank you so
not that by
much.
the time you get there, you've got a ticket?
No. Well, I have to watch out for that, too. But, yeah. So
Thank you. My
Wonderful.
pleasure. We have just about 5 minutes, so we'll try to rush through a couple more questions.
Okay. Frank, I know that Warner Brothers owns the right to the movie, The Wizard of Oz, but
That's
Frank
right.
Baum's books, those are in the public domain, correct?
Well, if they're not, don't bring it up now.
No. The reason I'm saying is that your works are possible because his works were allowed to lapse into the public domain.
No, that is true.
I'm
I'm just
genuinely worried that unless someone in Congress does something, nothing else will ever be allowed to lapse into the public domain simply because someone at Disney doesn't want Steamboat Willie to lose his trademark rights. If someone like William Shakespeare writing now, I don't think it's fair for someone in the year 2511 to have to go to, let's say, the guy's descendants just because Disney wants. I think that's what I'm just saying. I think something needs to be done to reform the public domains, and I'm sorry for hijacking.
no, it's okay. There would be no Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. There would be no Shakespeare in Love if Shakespeare's work were still under copyright. I quite agree with you. And when I was writing Wicked, I assumed that the works were out of copyright. And when I handed the book to my agent said, "Oh, aren't you smart? Did you know that the copyright just lifted on this 4 months ago? I'd been working on it for 4 years. I didn't know." I said, "Oh yeah, I am very smart." Yes, please.
I'm just curious, when you started working on Son of a Witch, how was it going back to a lot of those characters that it sounds like you hadn't intended to go back to?
I had not intended. I had intended Wicked to be a standalone book, and I had intended to leave people with questions. I had intended it that way so that one wouldn't feel that everything was tied up with a bow like in a children's book. In fact, we know in our real lives we die without all the answers, maybe without any of the answers. And even though it was a book about magic, I wanted it to have the feeling of verisimilitude. So in my Oz, people, yes, they have bravery, they have cowardice, they have power, they have evil, but they also have to go to the bathroom occasionally, and they fall in love, and they have sex, and they have problems with money. I put those coarser realities into the magic land of Oz in order to provide a background setting for the magnificence of when somebody is brave. So, to answer your question, what was it like to go back? The really curious thing and the thing that surprised me, the minute I started writing the story, the first scene, it was just like putting the needle back in the groove. One of the things that characterizes a certain kind of storytelling is a tone. And the Wicked tone was a certain tone that I had put on like a disguise that was intentionally sort of late 19th, early 20th century, particularly English fiction. And the tone was right there. The minute I decided to go back, the tone was right there. And so to me, that was a signal that the book was ready to be written. So let's see. How are we doing? 2 more minutes. How about you? And maybe we can squeeze in you, too. I'm not sure about you, but you can see me later.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
You wrote a short story for a children's anthology called Half Human. And it
Called which?
Half Human.
Oh, yes, right, right.
And that was with the Scarecrow. And I think it mentioned somewhere in there that that was because it didn't fit with your, you had already written it, but it didn't fit with your Wicked.
Right.
Okay, so then you wrote 2 other books, and evidently The Lion worked. So is it The Man of the Brain and The Man of Courage? One worked better than the other?
Effectively, what you're asking is why did you stick with the Lion and not stick with the Scarecrow and the Tin Man? For 2 reasons. Briefly, I told the people in the musical that although I wanted to go on with my story, I would do everything I could not to contradict what they had said happened in my story, even though I knew otherwise. So the Cowardly Lion they hadn't said very much about. Besides, when I thought about it more, I thought the Cowardly Lion is in some ways the weakest of those 3 characters, and therefore he has the most room for growth. Incidentally, I should tell you now, when we have only about 1 minute left, that Out of Oz is not here today. It's being published on November 1st. You can pre-order it at your independent bookstore or your non-independent bookstore. But I won't be able to sign it today, so this is just a little preview. You're the first audience to whom I've read a word of it. The other thing I want to say is that in about 6 months, I said there was going to be nothing more, but I have given for charity a little pamphlet called Tales Told in Oz. It's going to be published to raise money for Vermont libraries that were ruined in the recent hurricanes. And the Tales Told in Oz, there are 4 of them. There's the legend of St. Elphaba of the Waterfall. There's 4 improbable handshakes. And there's the story of the fox and the witch and the fox babies. which is the story that ends, and did she ever come out? Not yet. So you'll be able to read those whole stories from Madras Press, but you'll have to go online and find it somehow. Maybe check my website or my Facebook page. Hey, friend me. Yes.
Yes, you and several other of my favorite authors, like Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, are very adept at writing for children and adults. And I was wondering the process of that. Does a story come into your head that automatically is a children's story or automatically is an adult story, or do you kind of have to make a decision?
Every story is automatically for both children and for adults because they will get to it one way or the other.
Right.
So I try to write for the whole person and let them decide who's going to read it. And that's really true. If I know that a children's book publisher is going to bring out a story, obviously I don't use certain words about the human anatomy very often, but otherwise I try to put the depth of my moral concerns, even when I'm writing comically, into books for kids as well. And the language comes, it's that question of tone. The tone kind of asserts itself, and the tone in a way tells you who the audience is. I'm sorry about the person who was here, but I will be happy to answer a private question right after this. Thank you all very much. It's been a wonderful time.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.